Hi, I'm Trish McCaffrey from Insight. I work within our Solutions and Services group as a security consultant, and I'm here today with Andy from IDC.
Thanks, Trish. I'm Andy Buss and Consulting Manager here in Europe for IDC. My main role is to look at trends in the data center through the networking and security to reach the end client devices that we use to consume IT services.
Lovely. So what we're going to talk about today is cyber confidence and how important really security is in the changing digital world. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, what we find is that today it's a very different IT world. We are living in what we call the third platform age, which is one built of cloud, mobility, big data, and social business. So much more about interactions, network connectivity, being able to access services anywhere from any device. And that's changing how customers interact with us, how employees work, how data is shared, and it creates new challenges. And it also creates new opportunities for those who don't want to do good to get into our organizations and either steal information, hold us to ransom, or do bad things, essentially. And so we need to find out new ways to approach and tackle this going forwards to make sure that we've got secure foundations for our businesses as we become digital going forwards.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of the really hot button topics in IT, mobility, cloud, and we know what those can do for businesses. We know how it can help people to grow. But what are the security challenges? For instance, with the explosion of devices, what are you seeing there?
So we're seeing that smartphones are now the default choice in the Western economies and increasingly also in the emerging economies. So, for example, banking in Africa, the majority of banking in Kenya is done on mobile devices, not traditional banks. So a completely new way to do what is long regarded as a traditional activity. And that means we've got to have new ways to secure this type of interaction. But it's also new types of devices. So the PC is still a very relevant device, but it's no longer the majority or dominant force it once was. So now we've got tablets, and those are increasingly being adopted by enterprises now for official enterprise apps, as well as being a big consumer hit, and particularly smartphones, which now take on board both business and consumer personalities. And how do you, for example, manage iOS, Android, Windows, etc., in either a bring your own device or a corporate device issue scenario? And when we did a recent survey looking particularly at management and security of tablets and smartphones in business, only about 20% of companies had put in place a specific mobile device management solution that was a best-of-breed specialized package. Over half relied on the default tools that come with the devices. So it meant that if they had 3 different manufacturers of devices, there was 3 different tools. It made it hard to set consistent policies and protect against malware, etc. So going forwards, that needs to change. And so any solution that's looking at mobility needs to get to grips with all the devices being used, whether it's personal information or business information, because those do need to be treated separately. In fact, it's one of the critical points going forwards, because I've seen many companies say, you've got a device, but if there's any issues with it, we reserve the right to wipe that device. And usually what happens is people lose the phone and then don't report it for about a week while they hunt for it, because they know if they report it as lost, all their personal information that they haven't backed up will be wiped. So we need the ability to selectively wipe business applications and data from a device without impacting, say, the personal side as well.
To ensure people do stick to the policy because it's user-friendly.
Absolutely. And the other side is sort of end users don't know a lot about security, and we need to do some education about what it means, because we're not immune, and phones are often seen as immune because the Apple iPhone, for example, was one of the early leaders and had a very closed ecosystem. But now with Android being a big part of the market, it has a different type of approach to applications and services. So we do see a lot more malware in those markets, given the strength of Android today in the market. So we need to both educate users around phishing attacks, around malware as well, but we also need to make sure that the systems we put in place also help detect that and can help remediate it once there's an infection in place as well. And that is lacking at the moment.
Yeah, so obviously you've mentioned, mobile devices are really taking off, and one of the key things about them is that people are no longer in the office. They could be working from anywhere. So that means they're outside the traditional security of the corporate firewall. So how does that change the way businesses need to look at their security?
Well, we've already seen, I think, over the last a number of years that businesses have started to do a lot more IT externally, whether it's co-location, whether it's using cloud services, or whether it's moving to a much more mobile workforce. So to bring up a phrase from Cisco of years ago, it's the borderless network, but it's now the borderless enterprise. So an application can run almost anywhere and can be accessed from almost any device, be it business or personal. So it means we need to be a lot more sophisticated about how we detect and remediate threats. So the whole principle is basically you put in place the investment in the product to do the protection, then you have an investment in analytics to basically look for any suspicious behavior and detect a breach early. Then you need to plan for a response to that should you detect a breach, and then have a process for remediation to clean it up afterwards. And what we generally find today is that the investment side in products is where most companies are today. Very few go beyond that to the proactive detection of breaches. So we're finding that if a company is breached either on devices or in the infrastructure, that can often go 4 to 6 months before it's detected, and by that stage the damage is done. So increasingly we're going to look at security analytics and big data type techniques to help us determine when there's a breach or an infection going on much earlier. But then moving even beyond that, a big failing of many companies is a failure to plan for a breach. So we have a feeling of impregnability if we've invested in certain types of products and think that, well, we've done that, we're not going to be breached. And then the unthinkable happens and there's no response plan. So more and more companies have to accept that in today's age of very sophisticated malware creators out there, both nation states as well as highly organized criminal activities, against a company that basically has employees who are not that well equipped to deal with an attack, a breach will happen. It's not if, it's when. And as John Chambers at Cisco says, there's two types of companies, one that's been breached and one that doesn't know they've been breached. And it's these analytics that will really help to discover that. But the response plan is key, knowing what to do. So I could probably speak to 99 out of 100 companies today and say, what would you do if you detected that you've been breached? And most of them will go, we don't have a clue.
Or panic.
Absolutely. There was one company whose response was, let's just shut down all the servers, which is not exactly great if you depend on that for your revenue and profit. Just 1 day of downtime is basically almost 0.33% of your overall revenue, and the brand damage and associated problems that go with it, and also restitution, are huge at the end of the day. So you need to plan that you will be breached and understand whose critical roles and responsibilities are, and actually have a drill. I'd argue at least once a quarter, but definitely at least once a year. Go through a full security breach drill to understand what the process and response will be.
Yeah. So you've mentioned briefly, how the attack surface really has changed, how people are going out and about using all these different kind of devices, different operating systems. But how has the threat landscape reacted to that? How have the cyber criminals changed in the way they approach and attack businesses?
Well, there's two things really. So one is the mass hacking, essentially. So we've got these tools that are very sophisticated now that can go and attack any number of companies. So you're not safe no matter how small or obscure you may think you are, or even how big you are and how sophisticated you think you are. So the mass hacking will go on. Any type of breach, whether declared or not declared, is fair game. And there is such scale now, particularly also with the ability to use cloud and ubiquitous networking to reach huge amounts of the market. So we need to protect against this type of volume attacks where the slightest let up in capability means there's an entry point for them. The other side is a much more sophisticated attack. So we've seen a number of years ago an attack against RSA in the US, whose ultimate goal was not RSA, but a security contractor effectively. But they hacked RSA through a very determined spear phishing campaign to particular people with a particular type of infected spreadsheet that they engineered for them to open. We're seeing that more and more. So there's more activity around targeting the right people outside of IT in an organization to get an entry point and expand from there. And then the aim is to keep as quiet as possible, to remain undetected, to gather intelligence for the main attack, and then quite often to also obfuscate what you're doing by then launching multiple simultaneous attacks to hide the true purpose of the attack in all the noise. So we're seeing both the volume attacks increasing as well as the very, very sophisticated and targeted spear phishing type attacks.
Yeah, so we're seeing Even if a company thinks that they may be safe because perhaps nobody would target them, you're seeing a lot more of the opportunistic kind of attacks where they just look for essentially an unlocked door.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you cannot think that you're small enough or obscure enough that no one's going to attack you. These automated systems don't really care. They will search for any entry point and any weakness and go through. The other side is that the employee base is also something to worry about, because on the one hand, the criminal networks have lots of money, they're very well funded, so they can actually recruit some of the best and brightest programmers and security people to look for vulnerabilities, but they can also hire your staff to work against you, whether it's new starters who they've already paid to join a company, or whether it's someone who's been there years and feels a bit bored or disgruntled in their career path, and it's money for them to do so that they feel they can do without getting detected, or whether it's someone who's taken a job with another company and is looking to take some of the intellectual property or customer trade lists with them. All of these are scenarios where you can be compromised by your employee base, or also partners, so companies we work closely with around important contracts, design wins, etc.
Yeah, so it's really something that traditional security firewalls, antivirus and such just can't deal with. So how do you try to mitigate that kind of threat from the inside?
So a lot of it is to do with understanding behavioral patterns, and that comes from intelligence. So it's collecting information. So more and more things like event collectors and log collectors that enable aggregation of all the data points that are being generated throughout the network, but also from devices, and making sure that that information is collected and then analyzed. And what we're seeing is there's an on-premise approach where you can basically build an analytical capability around that, but also increasingly there's cloud facilities where you can upload your collection of logs, and it can also be acted on by a global threat intelligence type network that can then look at what's happening in other customers. So if you're in banking, for example, you could see if 3 banks have been hit by a malware outbreak or a threat, then other banks need to take action to protect against that, and we can see the same for other industries as well. So more and more it's about sharing security information, so both doing the internal analysis and protection, as well as using external providers as well to help go across multiple customers. But I think one of the keys is understanding what's normal on the network and making sure that where you can, critical information infrastructure is locked down. So making sure that in a data center that information is encrypted as need be, so it can't just be accessed by anyone, but also that key servers don't just allow random traffic from other hosts on the network, that those servers middleware servers only talk to the database servers that are authorized, and that they only talk to the web front ends that are authorized, to try and avoid this ability of attackers once in to almost have a free reign internally, because there is no traffic management and traffic shaping and IP address restrictions, etc. that go on. So we've got to be a lot more intelligent about locking down network traffic as well.
Yeah. So I think obviously big data plays a big part of this, but how can an organisation who maybe has 1 or 2 security specialists, or even perhaps none, perhaps it's just the role of somebody in their IT department, how can they make sense of all this data if they put the tools in place to see what's going on the network? How do they make sense of it?
Well, it's either to have the analytical tools and reporting dashboards with the correlation engines in place to basically drive the understanding. And we see that as well with just IT service delivery and management, looking at log correlation and understanding service delivery. But our recommendation is to use external experts. Very few companies can actually employ a team of security experts. They're lucky if they've got one part-time person who can focus on security a lot of the time. So we say look to resellers and VARs, or also look to managed security service provider partners to help them with this type of analysis and understanding, particularly as it goes across multiple different industries or customers in an industry. The other side of things is to have regular assessments. Compliance is one part of the solution. That to us is a minimum starting point. So things like PCI data security standard or data protection regulations, these are just the starting point for a secure foundation. They should be the minimum to run your business on. You should actually be looking at best practice beyond that, because these external threats are getting so sophisticated now, and the risk to information and brand and restitution is huge. So Heartland Payment Processing in the US had a breach while they were compliant with all the regulations. It still cost them close to $100 million to do the remediation and then also restitution behind it. And we saw Target. It was basically hacked through a third-party contractor who hooked into their systems to do air conditioning maintenance. And once they got a foothold, they breached the customer credit database and exfiltrated millions of records. The CEO left and the CIO left. So it's a career-limiting move in many cases, both senior management as well as IT management. So the key here is to understand that we can't live 100% risk-free. We cannot build a Fort Knox and be disconnected from everything, because otherwise, as businesses, we can't function. But we need to understand the level of risk we're exposing ourselves to for the level of reward that we get through revenue growth or profit, and make sure that it's the right profile. At the moment, we seem to just be buying product and not understanding how that relates to the risk of doing business.
Yeah. So do you see, as well as companies perhaps opening themselves up to new risks by looking at cloud mobility and all of that sort of stuff, do you see a lot of businesses perhaps holding back on new projects or new ways of working because of security concerns?
I must say, most companies I would speak to, security is not an integrated part of how they do IT service delivery. It is often an overlay that's brought in too late to projects, and by that stage it's very limiting to try and put security in as an afterthought, and it's expensive and hard and not very flexible. The best thing that we can recommend is that IT brings in security very early on in everything that is done. This is a foundation of what we call the third platform. Given it's network-centric and communication-centric, and it's to external providers and customers, etc., we need to build security in right from the beginning, because without that trust and integrity, this move to mobility and cloud and other things just will not be able to happen. So that type of communication needs to be assured, which means we need to have this type of proactive analytical capability around detecting security issues much, much quicker than we have done in the past.
And are a lot of businesses doing this today?
Not enough, I would say. We're at early stages still of the security analytics, so we're still very much in buying product and having people trained to configure the product and thinking that's a good enough place to be for security. So buying firewalls or buying IPSs and then thinking we've got a secure perimeter, so that's where we are. It is a borderless enterprise these days. So the likelihood is there are many different strains of malware already on the network, and there's probably a few compromised machines with advanced persistent threats that have been established for exfiltrating information, etc. These are not known about. So I mentioned earlier about 6 months from breach to detection. That's way, way too long. We need to actually discover breaches almost as they're happening to be able to then put in place plans to mitigate that and have a response. So ideally, you'd discover a breach within hours, if not minutes, if you had an analytical system in place to do so. The difficulty has been those analytical engines have been very complex to put in place with log collectors and rules and routines and analysis to make sure you know what's happening. As time's gone on, we've got better at understanding that and getting the integration going. And more we see this delivered as a cloud service. So it can be bought as security as a service from various providers today that can hook into those log collection engines and correlation engines that may be in place already.
Yeah, because I suppose previously log collectors were really used in an almost forensic way to discover how a breach happened after the fact, not to actually prevent it, but you're talking more about real-time threat detection.
Absolutely. So it's making sure that the information that's coming out of those events that go into the logs is able to be acted on real time. And this is one of the keys of the third platform, is the big data side, being able to have the advanced insight and analytics behind these approaches going forwards. So by making it a cloud service, you get rid of a lot of the integration and setup aspects of this type of advanced analytics. What you really need is a way to collect and ship the logs to the analysis service. And that's going to be the biggest angle. And as we go forward, more and more of those log collectors will be very standardized and using open APIs So in the past we had complex integration because the network elements wouldn't ship the information in the form you needed, or the firewall had a different format. So trying to get all the different infrastructure elements and the servers and storage all talking together was hard. But we're moving towards a more open API world. So the ability to put in place a collector of logs and then hook up to a number of cloud services to do the analytics, and you pay for the service, not for a bunch of sort of technology up front that you have to set up and integrate. So we'd say this is becoming more accessible to many more companies, and definitely something that should be looked at in the very near future. But I'd say the best thing that can be done is to get a partner in to really come and assess how your security is doing against what the business needs, but also what others in the industry are doing, and understanding if you're ahead of the curve or behind the curve, and understanding where targeted investment can really make a difference. So, as I say, a lot of this mobility explosion, there's a definite opportunity to improve the security posture and management of the devices to stop those entry points, but also a huge amount to do around understanding what's happening internally in the infrastructure to stop this very sophisticated range of attacks that we're seeing.
So why is it so important to get the outside, say you have a security team in-house, why is it so important to get that outside perspective?
Well, very few companies can employ a team of security experts. Most employ people whose job in security is often a part-time role, particularly in the mid-market and below. It's only really in financial services or similar, very highly regulated, with a high degree of revenue associated with it, and also a high degree of potential loss associated, that we actually see the investment in those, because the regulations say they have to, and therefore it's a common playing field. But in most other businesses where there isn't that regulation, this is a cost that they cannot afford to bear. It eats into the profit margins of the company. So what they tend to do is employ security product configurators that are trained to configure the Checkpoint firewall or the Cisco adaptive security appliance or similar. And while that's okay, it's hardly sort of best of breed and best practice. So by working with a partner, either an integrator or a managed security services provider or an assessor, they work across multiple industries with best practice all the time, and they can understand what needs to be done in terms of taking security as an overlay in the infrastructure into something that's really core to the business itself, and can help with their teams of security experts who see this day in and day out rather than being a part-time role. And particularly around assessments of best practice and compliance. This is a great way to start improving security posture. So as I say, compliance is really the starting point to aim for. It should not be the end point, but every business should at least be able to say we're compliant with a standard that's applicable to us. And if you don't have one, the PCI Data Security Standard is a great place to start, because it's designed for financial services and protecting financial information, and it will be broadly applicable to many businesses that store confidential private company IP or confidential private information on their customers. Great, so I think we've covered a lot of ground so far today, and we'd like to leave you with a number of key thoughts to take away around security. So first up is make security the core of everything you do. This world of the third platform and digital economies with customers who are ever more mobile and integrated into technology means it needs to be right in the fundamentals, not added on at the end. We're at the dawn of a new age of computing with many more types of devices coming to market. I now personally have about 7 that I carry regularly, but I'm a bit extreme. Most people have 2 or 3. But smartphones and tablets are very much changing how we do things, and data is becoming synced across all of that. We need to secure and manage these, and it's a challenge because getting an integrated management platform does require additional investment that oftentimes is seen as an extra cost, not as an insurance and a value add long term. So we need to change our thinking on security, that it's not a cost that has no value. What we're doing is, when we're successful, there is no noticeable impact. When we're not successful, there's a huge impact on brand and potential revenue generation. And without trust and integrity, this world of mobility and cloud is not going to happen, and we'll be at a competitive disadvantage to our peers in the industry, but also other nations globally. Attackers are getting very sophisticated, and they're getting very a lot of intelligence and hunting their targets very, very carefully. So we need to protect against that by educating our workforce, but also having these proactive analytics to help us understand when we've been breached as quickly as possible. And I think the key takeaway for the next year is to make sure that you have a response plan in place. If you detect you've been breached, it is to understand what you're going to do, who to inform, what steps you take, and how to mitigate it overall. Turning off all the servers is really not an option. So make security the core of everything you do.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Trish.